can you hear me? Just
Yeah,
checking.
sure can. Hi, Katie.
Great. And do we have Liz with us?
I believe Liz is in here. Yes.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure that we can hear both of you before we start.
Oh, actually, Liz is, oh, she might have just rejoined again.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for this breakout session. I'm going to hand it over to your facilitators. If you chose enabling environment for professionalized maintenance, you're in the right space. You're in the right Zoom room. Just a quick kind of overview of some guidelines for the breakout room is we really want to hear from you. I will be behind the scenes just kind of monitoring engagement. So please feel free to raise your hand to share your experience. When you're not speaking, though, we do encourage everyone to be on mute to kind of just cut down on background noise. And then feel free to change your name in Zoom so that we can see who you are. So maybe perhaps looking at La Mesa and how you presented your name is an example of what good looks like. So maybe your first and last name and your organization so that Caleb and Liz know who they're calling on so we can be really efficient and effective here. With that, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Caleb and Liz, to go ahead and get started.
Good. Thanks, Katie. And just let me know if my sound starts to cut out or anything like that. Welcome to Table 1. My name is Caleb Cord. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'll be presenting on a lot of our collaborative research with Wave Solutions alongside Liz Bulungiro, who is the Learning and Communications Coordinator for Wave in Uganda. So for a bit of background before we begin, kind of what do we mean when we're talking about the enabling environment for professionalized maintenance? We can think of a few ways that we might envision success for arrangements such as this. And one of those key metrics for success would be reliability, how functional hand pumps are under these arrangements, how quickly repairs are done when breakdowns are happening. And across plenty of these approaches that have published their results, including Waves, we see really high levels of reliability, functionality, and uptime rates that are well above 90%, sometimes close to 100%. What's known to a lesser extent is what influences their sustainability, the potential that these arrangements hold for providing that reliable service for the long term. And we can think about the various conditions that might influence the sustainability for these arrangements as kind of localized enabling environments and the different service areas where professionalized maintenance arrangements are implementing. And these are composed of operational conditions or the conditions that the service provider is in direct control of. So these would be things like tariff setting or the extent to which they're growing their services in the area, and contextual conditions spanning political, social, physical, and natural conditions to help us understand what that local service context is like. And when it comes to sustainability, what we really kind of examined in this deeper dive research topic was contract retention. So the extent to which contracts were held, over the time of SWS when they were initiated by Wave with communities. And this is, indicative of consistent revenue collection, potential for increased scale in the future and cost recovery, because for contract retention to happen over time, two things must be in place. Communities deciding to renew contracts on their own, an indication of their demand for these services, and that they're paying annual service tariffs, because the service provider will suspend contracts, if tariff payments aren't being made when they're due. So how can we enable high contract retention? So we applied FSQCA, or Fuzzy Set Qualitative Comparative Analysis, to try to understand across the different implementation contexts where Wave has been working throughout SWS, what pathways of conditions really enabled high contract retention, that consumer demand and consistent payment for rural water maintenance provision. As you can see here, across 2 different districts, we compiled case studies for 22 unique sub-counties where Wave was operating, and looked at each of these as kind of unique enabling environments varying in those social, political, natural, and physical conditions. FSQCA, or studies that qualitative comparative analysis, gives us a way to do a structured, rigorous, and replicable cross-case comparison, where we essentially built case studies for each of these 22 service contexts, and then use Boolean algebra and set theory to evaluate all of our data and identify pathways of conditions that all of the cases showing high contract retention shared with each other. Happy to talk more about that method for anyone who's interested, but that's just kind of a brief overview so that we can get to the results. And so really we saw two pathways to high contract retention for 9 cases out of our 22 that retained the majority of their contracts that were signed, well above 50%. All of those cases showed 2 conditions in common. Local government participation, one of those political conditions, where political and technical actors in each of these contexts were consistently involved with the service provider, fulfilling their work plans and mandates and actions that were outlined in regular public-private partnership reviews with the service provider, as well as consistent expansion, which essentially was the service provider, one of those operational conditions, continuing to engage new communities throughout the time, working with their government partners to make sure that happened. This effectively normalized concepts such as tariff payment or contract, engaging in contracts that might be new for rural communities. And the only other condition needed for success in all of our cases that achieved high contract retention but one was coordinated sector aid, which has been talked about at length throughout this SWS closeout event. NGOs and charities and organizations operating in line with local and national mandates and policies and with each other, the local government being fully aware of their work and making sure that they're not providing, free repairs on infrastructure in kind of an older way of thinking that seeks to undermine or acts to undermine the efforts of the service provider and their government partners. Alternatively, one case was able to achieve high contract retention without coordinated aid, but I do want to emphasize that that required significant efforts from the service provider and the local government to counteract that uncoordinated aid, and therefore really relied on some physical conditions like having larger user communities and being able to easily travel to these communities in order to counteract those efforts. So a few takeaways: the importance of local government participation for this, in the absence of aid coordination, pathways to success being really limited, and the fact that if we look at this top pathway, these are all social and political conditions. Of all the different conditions that we looked at across these realms, success really can be achieved, when we're looking at these sustainability indicators through social and political conditions. And I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Liz, through a recording, who's going to speak about ways that recommendations WAVE has from their learning for enabling this.
Aid coordination is crucial to contract retention. Without coordination, there are free alternatives from installations and major restoration works offered by NGOs and charities following long downtime. The one-time restorations benefit a small sample and disincentivize excluded communities from paying for preventive maintenance, and yet they are not sustainable. Our recommendation to donors from 10 years working experience is to finance a neutral monitoring and evaluation facilitator whose role is to ensure compliance with clearly demarcated roles and responsibilities among actors in rural water service provision.
Great, thanks Liz. Hopefully all of you could hear that recording as it was playing. So given the importance of local government participation and support in these arrangements, identified as key here, as well as in the collective action research, we asked what motivates local government support. And so, Uganda published a new O&M framework in 2019 to endorse professionalized maintenance, which it did in outlining roles and responsibilities, especially for these local government actors who act as the service authorities in Uganda. But given evidence of gaps between policy and practice that are, widespread across sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere in the world, we really wanted to know what potential this policy had to motivate local government support, and if not, what influences did motivate their actions. So we look over here on the right side. This kind of began by identifying roles and responsibilities, comparing this new O&M framework to previous policies and kind of existing expectations of what local government actors do, uncovering influences on action by following up with government actors then through 93 semi-structured interviews with government actors across all hierarchy levels in Uganda, in each of these 22 sub-counties and 3 districts. And then uncovering influences on action by taking the transcripts of those interviews and qualitatively coding and analyzing them to identify any reference influences on their actions and decisions. We were looking at influences on action through organizational institutional theory, which says that action is guided by regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive influences. I don't want to get too heady by getting too much into these descriptions, but really a regulative influence would be like this new policy. These are the formal rules that govern our behavior because of our fears of sanctions that come for non-compliance. Normative influences would be maybe ones that we're a little bit more used to working on the ground, influences and social pressures from our peers to behave in socially appropriate ways. And cultural cognitive influences being more of those deeply ingrained and embedded beliefs and kind of the shared ways of our thinking and perceptions of the world. And what we found is that regulative influences like policies rarely came up. So we had thousands of unique instances where these actors were mentioning influences on their actions and decisions, and regulative influences accounted for about 15% of those, referencing policies, government funding structures, those more formal structures. Normative influences came up a lot, relationship expectations, especially expectations between government actors and their constituents, politicians, for example, saying they take action because of what their electors expect of them, and political dynamics, and cultural cognitive influences like cultural beliefs, notions of identity. So regulative influences are not really going to be enough to motivate local government support, and that may not be surprising to a lot of us. However, importantly, existing influences can be leveraged to motivate this support because every single instance of influence that we found was cited by at least one person, and usually multiple, to support actions or motivate actions in line with this new O&M framework. So we don't necessarily need to change these influences, like political dynamics, for example. We just need to change the way that we talk about them and the incentives we put in place. Things like political dynamics can motivate actors, and we have evidence that it does, to take action in line with professionalized maintenance. And lastly, government funding structures may limit policy compliance, one of those regulative influences that came up a lot, if resources aren't made available for these actors to fulfill these mandates. And then I'm going to quickly play one last audio from Liz, talking a bit more about motivating local government support on the ground in Uganda.
Local government support is essential. For that reason, we establish public-private partnerships with local governments for reliability assurance of rural water sources. District water officers have a long list of broken hand pumps because local government uses the maintenance budget to pay only for major restorations. However, in the PPP arrangement, local government uses their maintenance budget to provide enabling services. These include mobilizing communities to sign contracts with a professional preventive maintenance service provider and setting prices. One example of this is in June 2020, Nakaseke District Local Government appointed WAVE as the service utility for rural water sources. The district local government then issued a pre-works maintenance protocol to organizations investing in infrastructure, such as WASH NGOs, to ensure maintenance agreements are first understood, signed, and paid up before any works. The district local government is also now convening regular PPP reviews.
Great, thanks, Liz. And we'll now take any questions. I think we only have a few minutes, but if anyone has questions or thoughts on this research, we would be more than happy to talk about them.
Thanks, Caleb. Since we're on Zoom, we could just folks unmute, or if you wanted to raise your hand for a question, we can do that as well, since we have the interaction here, which is nice, other than other platforms. Maybe I'll start out with one, Caleb. I mean, thinking about the balance between looking at local government efforts versus national government efforts, and like what kind of initiatives may be better focused, and Liz as well, you mentioned this in your presentation, better to focus on locally versus nationally, and how, maybe how has WAVE even thought about balancing those two approaches?
Liz, I'd like to give you a chance if you want to answer that first, and unmute yourself.
Sorry, I missed it just a little bit. I got disconnected. Could you repeat it, please?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Thinking about the balance between acting at the local level with the local governments versus nationally, and the national government efforts? Like, what types of activities do you think are better to focus within local government versus focusing with the national level governments?
Yeah, so at the local government level, what we focused on was proof of concept, showing that communities are buying into the service, they're paying for it, which was not in the baseline situation. They're receiving a good service for their payments. That's what we focused on at the local level, and as we got communities to appreciate the service, and as we scaled up, then the local government saw that this was actually possible. And then at the national level, we focused on advocacy for adoption for the whole country. So that's what resulted in adopting Waves model. We did it in two ways. We did it at the high level, and then at the local government level, we're doing proof of concept.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Caleb, as far as your research goes, do you have any insights on those?
Yeah, I think that, a big premise for this work was that national policy published by Uganda. And so I think policy development is kind of a really important component of the enabling environment that needs to come from national levels, just to put those frameworks in place, but must be operationalized at local levels. And I think we have a lot of evidence from our interviews that local government actors have a lot of agency in the communities, because they're actually living in these user communities where Wave is servicing hand pumps most of the time. And especially politicians have a lot of leverage over those community perceptions, and have a lot of potential to initiate demand and generate buy-in for picking up these arrangements. So I definitely think there's a lot of efforts that have to kind of combine from both levels that are pretty vital for getting these arrangements to be sustainable. But getting those formal structures in place at the national level, making sure there aren't like national level politicians and things undermining these arrangements, and setting up coordination bodies. And then at the local level, engaging these local government actors who have a lot of potential to generate that demand.
Great. Thanks, Caleb. And I look forward to your publication along with Liz as co-author, which is awesome. So thanks both of you for the efforts and for the great presentation. Katie, over to you, maybe.
Yeah, so I realized that it is time to transition, if you wanted to a second round of discussions and presentations. So I'm going to once again drop in the link to the chat to all of you. If you feel like you want to stay and kind of continue the conversation, feel free to go ahead and stay and ask Caleb and Liz additional questions. Or if you want to transition to a second table topic, the link that I just sent should give you an opportunity to transition to another table. And we'll just take a minute and see how you all are feeling, if you want to stay or if you want to transition to another room. Now, it looks like we have a question coming in from Lamessa here. Lamessa, can we invite you to maybe come off mute and share a little bit more about what you posted in the chat function here?
Good, thank you, Caleb and Elizabeth. It was really nice to listen to you from your experience in Uganda. Sometimes, most of our policies and the strategies are a kind of adaptation from other countries. Policies and the strategies are not really based on existing practices in a country. This is just I'm saying this based from our experience in Ethiopia. So having those proof of concept from local level and feeding into those existing policies and the strategies is really a good way of getting buy-in from decision makers to revise those policies and strategies. So my impression is it is always good really to start from the existing countries' policies and the strategies and identifying those gaps and working on that. Because what government actually lacks in our case, for example, is most policies and the strategies are already there. but the rolling out of those policies and the strategies and how they look like in terms of implementation is a big gap. So we actually began from those existing government policies and strategies that really smoothens the communication with government officials, and also to get buy-in from their side on how to adapt in the policy and the strategy revision. Back to you.
Thanks, Lamessa. I think those are really good points. And, you know, I do want to also just point out that this O&M framework in Uganda was in a lot of ways.
That,
Go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, so I think that I completely agree with you on that. And actually, that's what made WAVE's case very interesting. The fact that once we build a number of NGOs at the national level to rally around a professionalized maintenance approach, then we are able to actually sorry, excuse me. Yes, so we started to work once we got it to adopt WAVE's model. So that's what we are doing. We are now working hand in hand with a number of NGOs to use professionalized maintenance approach in place, and it's working really well because we're having the conversation on the table and everyone is
So Liz, it seems like we're having some connection issues.
To talk about, you know, coordinated water service delivery, and it's interesting to see this unfold.
Yeah, Liz, thanks for sharing. It sounds like you're having a little bit of connection issues, but just to reiterate a lot of what I think you were beginning to touch on is that the national O&M framework in Uganda really was kind of a result of proof of concept from a lot of professionalized maintenance providers.
Sorry, could you not hear me just then?
Liz, you were cutting out quite a bit. I think your connection's just dropping and coming back a lot.
Yes, sorry about that.
No problem, Liz. I think we're going to go ahead. We do have some new people in the room, so we're going to go ahead and kind of reiterate some of these findings again. So for those that are just joining us, you know, feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat for us to talk about. I'm going to try to move through these results fairly quickly so we can save more time for discussion. But if you've also, you know, if you've heard these once, feel free to join another room at the link that Katie has dropped in the chat. So again, this is table 1, enabling environment for professionalized maintenance. I'm Caleb Cord, a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado, presenting on a lot of our collaborative research with WAVE over the last 5 years, alongside Liz Buhunjiro, who is the Learning and Communications Coordinator at WAVE. So when we talk about enabling professionalized maintenance, we can think of, you know, a host of outcomes or, you know, success metrics we'd want to see from these arrangements. But kind of like the big one that's always been at the forefront of folks' minds is reliability. Are they actually able to demonstrate improvements to functionality, repair times, when breakdowns are happening, and preventing those breakdowns in the first place? And from a host of professionalized maintenance arrangements that have demonstrated improvements, you know, that have published results, we do see demonstrated improvements to reliability. Folks saying that, you know, uptime and functionality rates well above 90%, close to 100%. But it's important for us to now understand what leads to their sustainability, what conditions influence the long-term ability of these arrangements to provide that reliable service sustainably for the long term. And we can think of this in terms of operational conditions and contextual conditions. So the operational being the components that are in the control of the service provider, for example, tariff setting or their level of growth in an area, contextual conditions, political, social, physical, and natural conditions that vary a lot from across the service areas where professionalized maintenance arrangements are being implemented. And for sustainability, again, there's a lot of metrics we can look at. For this study, we chose to focus on contract retention over the time of SWS. So out of the contracts that were signed with communities, how many of them were retained throughout the project? This indicates consistent revenue collection, potential for increased scale in the future as pilot service providers become more viable, and cost recovery, because contract retention indicates two things both happening. Communities are deciding to renew their contracts each year, indicating their demand for the service, and paying annual service tariffs because their contract would be dropped by the service provider otherwise. So how can we enable high contract retention? So we applied FSQCA, or fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, which is a structured, rigorous, and replicable cross-case comparison method based on 22 case studies that we developed of different contexts where WAVE is implementing. And so these are sub-counties across 3 different districts that vary a lot in those social, political, natural, physical, and operational conditions. And we were asking what of those conditions are enabling high contract retention in the cases where we're seeing that. If you have more questions about the method, I'm happy to answer them, but I really want to focus some more time on the results. And so this is really what we found. So across the 9 out of our 22 cases that retained the vast majority of contracts that were signed, we saw 2 important conditions that all shared in common. And this echoes, I think a lot of these findings also echo results from other branches of the work on SWS. But local government participation was a really essential component, especially getting politicians and technical officials at local levels to fulfill agreed upon actions and work plans, participating in regular reviews with the service provider, really kind of leveraging their relationships with communities to further legitimize the service provider and increase accountability and trust between the provider and those community members. And then consistent expansion at the same time. The service provider continuing to engage new contracts over time. We can think of this in terms of, if we were to sign a contract with a new cell phone service provider or something like that, we would want to see people that we know, we'd want to see continuous growth going on to further legitimize that service, normalize new concepts, for example, tariff payment and signing into contracts in rural communities. The only other condition really needed for success across these, in 8 out of the 9 of our cases, achieving high contract retention was coordinated sector aid. So this top pathway up here. Again, echoing a lot of messages from previous SWS presentations, having NGOs and charities, a local sector that is coordinated with each other and with the government, following mandates and policies, and not providing, for example, free repairs that undermine all of the work that the service provider and their government partners have put in to develop and strengthen these systems. One case was able to achieve high contract retention without coordinated aid, but relied on really intense efforts on the part of the service provider's local field office in that area to counteract that uncoordinated aid and gain communities' buy-in and demand, which really relied on physical conditions like large user communities and ease of access to those communities. So some takeaways, how essential local government participation is in the absence of aid coordination, pathways to success being pretty limited, and the fact that success really can be achieved largely through these social and political conditions, because out of all of the different social, political, natural, and physical conditions we looked at, these were really the ones that were essential for success in the context achieving the highest contract retention. So I'm going to play a recording from Liz now speaking on the importance of sector aid coordination and a recommendation from their work in Uganda.
Coordination is crucial to contract retention. Without coordination, there are free alternatives from installations and major restoration works offered by NGOs and charities following long downtime. The one-time restorations benefit a small sample and disincentivize excluded communities from paying for preventive maintenance, and yet they are not sustainable. Our recommendation to donors from 10 years working experience is to finance a neutral monitoring and evaluation facilitator whose role is to ensure compliance with clearly demarcated roles and responsibilities among actors in rural water service provision.
So on to another important topic, local government support, which emerged as essential for professionalized maintenance arrangements. We wanted to follow up on this more and understand the influences on local government support. So, as has been mentioned multiple times in this event, Uganda has a new national operation and maintenance framework that really endorses professionalized maintenance pretty explicitly, and outlines new roles and responsibilities for a lot of actors, including the local governments who act as service authorities. But given evidence of gaps between policy and practice that are rampant over the last several decades, we ask what potential this policy has to motivate local government support. And if it's not going to be able to do the job, what influences do motivate action? So over here on the right, we can see kind of the process for this research. We began by identifying the roles and responsibilities that shifted in this new O&M framework from previous policies, and then followed up with local government actors to gain their perspectives on those shifts. We conducted 93 semi-structured interviews with government actors from all hierarchy levels across all of these 22 sub-counties and 3 districts, asking about influences on their decision-making in the past and behavior and potential for their fulfillment of these new roles and responsibilities. And then we qualitatively coded and analyzed the transcripts from those interviews based on organizational institutional theory to try to identify those influences. Under the theory that we were applying, regulative influences are kind of those of policies, for example, and more formal structures that influence our behavior, largely because of our fears of the sanctions that come from non-compliance. Normative influences would be more along the lines of social pressures from peers to act in kind of appropriate ways based on what's expected of us in society. And cultural cognitive influences being more related to our beliefs and kind of our internal understanding of the world around us, our notions of identity, for example. And so in our results, and this is from thousands of unique instances where these actors were citing an influence on their actions and decision-making, from so many interviews that were usually more than an hour long each. And only 15% of those thousands of references were regulative. So very rarely, and this is notable because in institutional theory generally, in previous studies that have used this, these are the ones that come up the most often. People are generally biased towards regulative influences, but only 15% of the time did they come up. Normative influences on these roles and responsibilities, however, came up 35% of the time. Relationship expectations, political dynamics. This may not be too surprising for a lot of us who've worked in this space for a long time, or those of you that have worked in this space for a long time, but also cultural cognitive influences. Again, in the use of this theory, these usually don't come up very often, but they came quite a bit. Cultural beliefs, like the belief that water is life or should be available for free, notions of identity, what it means to be a leader. And so, a few takeaways: regulative influences alone are not enough to motivate this support, but existing influences, every single one of these influences across the pillars of institutional influence, were cited by at least one actor and usually several actors to motivate actions in line with the new O&M framework. So for example, things like political dynamics were not always referenced to be negative, and with the right messaging and incentives in place, we don't necessarily need to change these influences or get rid of them. It's more about positioning them and positioning the actors under these influences to take the action that we really think would lead to more sustainable services. And so
Caleb, I don't
now
mean
again,
to cut in, but we have some really good activity in the chat. Maybe we can get some questions since that might help to stimulate
Sure.
some of the discussion too. Since we only have 3 or 4 minutes left over. We've got a couple of questions. Jeff, Albert mentioned, for the QCA output, is it correct to conclude that for communities that were either remote and or low population, the coordinated sector aid was a necessary condition for sustained contracts, or was it even sufficient?
So in QCA terminology, coordinated sector aid wasn't necessary, given that there was one case that was able to achieve success without it. But I think it's really difficult. It was a significant condition in that pathway on its own. And it was really important for essentially making sure that the service provider wasn't having to spend large amounts of resources to counteract the efforts from a large and powerful NGO that had been providing free repairs and construction on infrastructure, and therefore affecting community mindsets for several decades, actually, in that case. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, Jeff, feel free to unmute as well. But another mention was about, can you speak more about how coordinated sector aid is operationally defined? What is it? How does it actually work? What does it mean?
Yeah, within our cases. So we, yeah, Liz, did you have a comment?
Yeah, so what we define as coordinated sector aid is instead of supporting ad hoc interventions for water service delivery, maybe sector aid could be pointed towards funding a national M&E coordinator who makes sure that there are possibilities for all the stakeholders. Is a professional maintenance service provider, and then the government is doing regulation, and everyone is rallying around professionalized maintenance so that we don't have an NGO providing a free service in this community, and then in the same community there's a professional maintenance service. So basically making sure that everyone's efforts are coordinated and achieving what they're supposed to achieve.
Thanks, Liz, for unraveling that. It is a mouthful for sure, and it's hard to understand what it actually means, but that was very clear. Appreciate that. And then we had a question from Lewis, Caleb. How do your findings, and Liz as well, relate to the uptime work that Oxford and RWSN have been working on to find other service providers that might be able to participate in Uptime's funding facility and expand its reach and impact?
Yeah, I actually I'm fairly new to that work that's going on. I attended kind of the Zoom webinar that was going on last week that touched on that work with Duncan. Yeah, I'm curious, Louis, if you're aware of any findings that have kind of already come out from that in terms of, maybe some of those operational conditions on the part of service providers that are important for their long-term sustainability.
I would like to say that actually WAVE is part of Uptime. So we took part in the study, but I do not know as yet how the results relate to a particular study. Sorry to say.
I think I've had a little bit of a preview of that from Duncan on a call a week or two ago, and I think there were hundreds of respondents to that survey, but I believe they did not find that many respondents who, at least at this point, have the data necessary to participate. And that doesn't surprise me a whole lot, but I guess one of the things I'm hoping is that out of this work, as well as Uptime's work, maybe it will be, it will help, whether it's sort of independent service providers like WAVE or Fundafix, as well as potentially government, more public service providers, to figure out how to help them get better data. Because without the data, there's no way you can participate in outcome-based funding.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
In Uganda.
What was that, Liz?
We actually, with a group to increase the availability, rationalize the national and framework by increasing professional service provision in rural communities. So I think in a few years, we'll have more organizations with that kind of data. Yeah, go ahead, Caleb.
I was just going to maybe echo that point, Liz. I think that as we see more professionalized maintenance providers continuing to kind of grow and scale their operations, hopefully we'll continue to see kind of more data and information availability coming up, which is pretty essential for our understanding of these professionalized maintenance providers and what potential they hold for providing not only reliable services, but services that are sustainable. One thing we weren't able to analyze as much in this study was those operational conditions. We ended up having to focus a lot more on the contextual ones, which wasn't a bad thing. It lended some really interesting results. But differences in operational approaches and the way that those influence long-term sustainability, I think is a pretty important area for future research. to better understand the way that context interplays with the different ways that service providers can implement these arrangements.
Yeah, clearly you need both. You need the enabling and you need the operational. But like, as in a lot of work that you guys have done, you have definitely moved things along here in a very helpful way. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming and engaging. Appreciate it. And Jeff, I see another comment in the chat. I'm just reading that really quick. So the coordination condition. So I guess really quickly, the way that we looked at that, it was not a binary variable. It was a kind of like on a longer scale where we allowed variation across our cases. And we were drawing on data from local government actors, those who were responsible for essentially monitoring and coordinating these actors and hosting the platforms where they're supposed to be engaging with them, as well as, I think my headphones might be dying. Hopefully you're able to still hear me. Someone just let me know if not. But we were using that data as well as information from the NGOs themselves and from WAVE field office staff through a lot of focus group interviews, discussions and interviews. And what we did was we essentially kind of came up with a scale where we considered a case to be fully in the set of coordinated sector aid, either if there were no other NGOs or aid actors present, which was the case in maybe 2 or 3 of our cases, or if every NGO that was referenced was talked about pretty highly by the local government and was consistently taking, we had specific questions about, are they charging communities tariffs or, for any repairs that they're doing, and have they been doing that historically? Do they attend your regular coordination platform meetings with the government? Have you ever had instances of NGOs or charities popping up in your sub-county where you weren't aware of them or they didn't ask permission? So we had a few indicators like that. And we essentially determined a score of, 1, if everything that we would have wanted to see from that sector aid coordination was present, and then like on down with, like a score of 0 being assigned to the case if none of that was true. Hopefully that gets a little bit more to your question, but in the paper that we're intending to publish from this work, hopefully soon, we'll include all of those details in the supplemental information. So you're more than welcome to take a look at that. And hopefully we'll be sharing that, pretty soon.
Thank you, Caleb. I think we are at time, actually a little past time. I know that was a quick marathon, but hopefully these last kind of few presentations were useful for everyone. So thank you, Seth and Jeff, for joining us and sticking with us. I am just here to kind of close everything out. Caleb, I didn't know if you or Liz had any kind of final thoughts.
No, I'd just like to thank everyone for participating and all the questions and thoughts. There will be a research brief from all this enabling environment research, culmination of multiple studies coming out soon, as well as academic articles on all of this work. Just working on taking this research and putting it into a form that can be disseminated and used, which, Liz will be co-author on every single one of those papers. So yeah, we look forward to sharing that with all of you.